Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a special budget week edition of Head to Head. And I'm really chuffed and delighted to have Mark Littlewood from the IEA with me tonight. And before we get into the meat of it, hello, Mark, and maybe you can just give a few words to everyone, tell everyone about the work you do at the Institute of Economic Affairs.
Well, good evening, Bill. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with you. Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, of which I'm the rather grandly titled Director General. Just means I'm the chief executive of it. We're a think tank based in Westminster. We've been around since the 1950s. So we describe ourselves, I think, fairly as Britain's original free market think tank. We have a turnover of about £2 million a year. A little over 20 staff. And some of your viewers, Bill, might be saying, well, what the hell is a think tank? What's that really mean? Our job is to think about public policy questions, sometimes immediate controversies like the budget, sometimes rather longer term issues. How's the world of work going to change over the next 10 or 20 years? What's the environmental agenda mean over the next 10 or 20 years? And to try and inform and guide public debate from our perspective in a free market direction. We're not political in the sense that we don't support any political party. We're actually an educational charity, but we are of a particular school of thought. And the IEA, although we don't have a corporate position or a manifesto on anything, we're a bunch of people and scholars who believe that free markets work. And if you want a healthy, wealthy and wise population, then more or less, the more you allow the market to do, and the less the government and the state does, the better.
Which sounds a pretty reasonable approach to take from my point of view. And you talk about controversy there, but surely in this conversation we're going to have now, there's no controversy because we just had a most fantastically popular budget. And just to quote you, YouGov, the eternal source of all knowledge and information, on a snap poll that was done of people who had seen the budget and their opinions on the budget, of all voters, 46% were in favour, 11% against. Of Conservatives, 66% were in favour and 5% were against. And here's the whammy, of Labour voters, 38% were in favour and only 18% against, with a lot of don't knows obviously mixed in there. So it was a really successful and popular budget, wasn't it, Mark?
Well, on those numbers, yes, it was. If the aim of the budget is to secure good opinion poll figures within 24 hours, Rishi Sunak will be pleased. And I think I can also lob into that mix something else that Rishi Sunak might be looking at, his own odds to become the next leader of the Conservative Party. He was the favourite. He's now even clearer as a favourite. And I'll say this: I think he's a class act. He's a good performer. He's an intelligent man. I think he's been a kind of reassuring voice during COVID. I can see why the British public take to him. I bear him no personal animus at all. I know him a bit. I don't know him well, and he's a very civilised presence. But I think I'd say this, Bill, and this is my basic view of economics, and a real problem for those of us on the free market side of the ledger. Socialism is rather popular in contemplation, but disastrous and unpopular in effect. And you'll see this in polls about almost anything, really. And the budget, which I think was to a large extent a socialist budget, a big state budget, has been popular in contemplation. It won't be so popular if it doesn't get the economy going again. And whenever you ask people questions, the opinion polls tend to come out as, oh, yes, I think we should take more from the rich and give it to the poor. I think we should spend more on the National Health Service and on education and on public transport and on defence and on a myriad of other things. And opinion polls do pick those sort of things up. But they're what nerdy economists like me, Bill, call stated preferences. It's quite easy to give a stated preference about something. I intend to give up smoking. I intend to drink less. I intend to lose weight. I'm going to exercise more. These are stated preferences, and opinion polls pick up stated preferences. Much more interesting are people's actual revealed preferences. Have you actually taken more exercise? Have you actually given up smoking? Are you actually drinking less? And I think big state spending plans and sort of let's go after the big corporations to sort of pay off some of the debt and balance the books. popular as in contemplation, popular as a revealed preference in the polls. I think people's actual behaviour and actions will be rather different. And look, the test for this government, and, you know, my God, you've got to have some sort of sympathy for them in terms of the rocky road, right? I mean, elected in December 2019, got to get Brexit done like that. I think they've been pretty successful in that regard. But no sooner have you got that over the line and the COVID pandemic hits, the real test for the government is going to be, what does the economy look like in a year or two's time? And I fear there that even if they're getting popular opinion poll numbers at the moment, the actual economic effects will not be particularly impressive at all. And most likely, the government will win or lose the next election based on a whole array of factors. But are people actually feeling richer? Do they actually think their lives are improving? And you're much better. Margaret Thatcher was a master at this, to take decisions that might actually be unpopular in the short term, but that you're confident will yield medium-term effects. Margaret Thatcher was very happy to make very unpopular decisions. Geoffrey Howe's budget was one of the least popular ever, but the impact of it on the economy was so good that a couple of years down the road, she harvested a lot more popularity. So you're probably right about that snapshot. I'm afraid I'd be in the 11% of people who was completely underwhelmed by the budget. But I don't think that's the end of the story. And if the government are thinking in those short-term horizons of what's tomorrow's newspapers and today's opinion polls, they'll be pleased. But that's the wrong horizon for them to be looking at.
Well, it's an interesting angle that you look at there in terms of the rocky road that they've been on, and all of us can agree it's been unimaginably difficult, and without getting into the wrongs and rights of lockdown, not least because we don't want to be taken off air, but without getting into the wrongs and rights of it, it has been an extraordinary period in our economic history where we've literally gone into a form of stasis for 12 months, except for the fact that the government has been paying lots of people to stay at home, but still paying them their full wages. So we're in a position where the debt is over 2 trillion, I believe, and the deficit's up to 400 billion. In the light of that, Chancellor Sunak said he was going to level with people and be honest with people, and that he felt that there needed to be tough measures. And that was almost touching on a little bit of the Thatcherite days rhetoric. This budget, does it really contain any of those kind of measures that would set us up? Is there anything here that gives you, as an economist, any sort of hope that we're going to be righting the fiscal ship?
Not much, to be honest. I mean, there's one area in which Rishi Sunak has been thinking in the classic standard Treasury bean counting way. That he has sort of said, look, we're running an even bigger deficit this year. The context of this is important as well, Bill. It's not just COVID-19 and the lockdown that's battered the public finances. They were in a pretty appalling state before we went into this lockdown. It wasn't as if we'd built up a fantastic surplus and a sovereign wealth fund to tide us through the bad times. Essentially, the public register, the Register of Public Finances was dripping red this time last year. It's now bleeding red. I mean, a bad situation has got far, far worse. Now, what Rishi Sunak saying is a signal that he's serious about that, is if we're spending all of this money, we're going to have to raise it somehow through taxes. Maybe not all of it now, but we're going to put up corporation tax. He's freezing the income tax thresholds, which in essence is an increase in income tax. Now, to be honest with you, I'm a bit more dovish rather than hawkish over the short term. I've been banging on for years about the appalling state of the public finances, and they're even worse now. But we probably don't need to course correct in the next 6 months. We need to get the economy back on its feet, open up again. Hopefully, we should be able to, if you like, recover the lost ground of the pandemic, because although national income's gone backwards about 10%, it's not as if we've had a literal war, right? It's not as if buildings have been razed to the ground. By and large, we should be able to return to normal relatively quickly. The question is what happens next? And I would have preferred an approach to say, we're going to supercharge the economy over the next year or two. Yes, the public finances are in a bad state, and we are going to have to seriously return to that. But in a year or two's time, we'll have a long, hard look at that. And that will probably have to mean expenditure cuts, not tax rises, if you want to, if you actually want to try and balance the books. Why do I say that? Because in broad terms, and this is a broad analysis, I wouldn't say it's true to the last decimal point, we are at what economists would call the taxable limits of the economy. We've now got to a situation where taxes are so high, they're the highest they've been as a proportion of national income since 1951, the Clement Attlee government coming to an end, that if you dial up rates much more, you're probably not going to get in any more revenue, basically. You're actually going to see, I don't know, people retire early, capital flight, the rest of it. I think that could be the consequence of dialing up corporation tax. So it's very difficult to see how tax can do much more of the heavy lifting. It's now trying to get blood out of a stone. We've moved from a medium tax economy to a very high tax economy in terms of British history. And there's not much more you can get out of there. You might be able to squeeze a drop or two here or there, but we're going to need more than a few drops to balance the books. And that means without very impressive economic growth, and although the forecasts for that, and take forecasts with a bucket of salt, are that we'll get back to the pre-lockdown levels pretty quickly in a year or two. After that, it looks sluggish again. The economy will only be growing at around about 1.6% a year, feeble by historical standards. And unless you can get growth really going upwards, 3% per year growth, 4% per year growth, those sort of numbers, then the government's not going to have the money and the revenues. It probably can't squeeze much more out of the private sector. It's going to have to make some big decisions on cutting spending on the expenditure side. And it hasn't turned its attention yet to what it might cut. And I'm not talking about sourcing cheaper paper clips or, cutting back on a little bit here and a little bit there, or reducing MPs' expenses. That's nickel and dime stuff. You're going to have to find, 100 billion, 200 billion in savings, those sorts of numbers. Something like the budget of the National Health Service is going to have to be found in savings. You probably don't do that by closing down the National Health Service, but that's to give you an indication of the scale of the sort of spending reductions we're going to have to make, unless you can find a way of getting the economy growing really rapidly.
Yeah, and interestingly, as you were speaking, a couple of our viewers have put comments onto the screen, Harry Johnston and Jed 52%, who've put on basically similar comments about the fact that the public sector has grown both in importance and in proportion of the economy over the last year, and the private sector has been damaged. And that is, after all, I think most people would accept the wealth creating part of the economy being the private sector. So it's even more damaging, this sort of saturation of taxation onto those people who we really need to grow, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. It's deeply problematic. Let's try and take, because I don't just want to give a good kicking to the government, I'll give them a pretty heavy kicking, but let's take a sympathetic approach for the sake of argument. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that COVID-19 was an absolute national emergency, should be treated like a time of war. We had to close down the economy in the way we did in order to stop hundreds of thousands of deaths. Let's just assume that. I know lots of people dispute that, and there's lots of parts of the lockdown I'm unsatisfied with. Well, you expect the public sector to grow, right? The public sector grew quite a lot under Winston Churchill during World War II, right? The private sector did not have a particularly good time of it, and the public sector grew. The important thing is to make sure that isn't a permanent feature of our economy. And we need to get back to the private sector being the bigger part. It's not just the better part of generating wealth, Bill. It's the only part. There are tax producers and tax eaters, and the public sector are the tax eaters. You might like them. You might want nurses and doctors and teachers there, but it's the productive side of the economy that keeps that going. And to give you a scary number, in roundabout terms, the final data isn't in, but in roundabout terms, the public sector this year will account for about 56% of all national income. That's to say, for every pound spent in Britain, 56p of it will be government money. I mean, this is just extraordinarily high. The fastest growing economies in the world, by and large, both now and historically, tend to have a public sector of around about 20%, 25%, that sort of level. Most economists agree that the former Soviet Union had a public sector that amounted to about 70% of the overall economy. So where you find Britain now, okay, we haven't got the gulags and Stalin in charge or anything like that, but where you find us purely on the measurement of how big is the state as a proportion of your economy, is we are far closer today, as we talk today, to the Soviet Union style economy than we are to the fastest growing economies in the world, the likes of the Singapores. That can't be a sensible place to be long term, even if you accept that's how we might have ended up because of the national emergency of the last 12 months.
And you stole my thunder there, because I was about to say that's approaching Soviet Union levels. And one of the interesting things as well, really, about this is that we're inevitably, we need to get onto the corporation taxing. I think it's going to be one of the major factors of discussion. I'm talking about hurting the private sector. It's recently come out, the Tax Fund Foundation in USA has shown that the UK is now in 29th place for being the best place for investment after this budget, down from 17th. And you mentioned Singapore as well. One of the things I remember from my time out in Brussels as an MEP was that they were terrified. They kept on saying, we don't want a Singapore just off our coast. We don't want that to happen, because quite clearly it would succeed. Now, the government is taking us more in the Soviet direction than the Singapore direction. And this corporation tax, huge increase in corporation tax, I find it remarkable. I find it almost impossible to believe a conservative government would even contemplate doing such a thing. I mean, I'm guessing you're going to have a similar view to me on that, but can you sort of dissect the damage that's going to do?
Yes, I think it could be severe. It is true that on corporation tax rates, when we were at the present 19% level, which I think sticks with us for another year, I believe, before it actually goes up to the 25%. That is, on the face of it, a pretty competitive rate around the world. It's not the best. It's not as good as the Republic of Ireland, for sake of argument, but it's not bad. If you wanted to have a signal of Britain being a good place to invest, a good economy to do business in, the corporation tax headline rate, well, that was relatively good. What I'm getting annoyed in is people are sort of saying, well, given that, we might as well surrender that comparative advantage, right? I sort of, well, I mean, if the French can have it much higher, or the Germans, why don't we have it much higher? And they sort of criticize people like me for wanting a race to the bottom, as if having the highest possible tax rates is the thing that you should be aspiring to. I think that's a race to the bottom. So I think there's politics in this rather than good economics. And the politics is that somehow you're taxing the big, rich, billionaire, abstract corporations. You know, somehow this money is going to be just sort of paid by whatever, Amazon, Google, the FTSE 100, whoever it might be. You know, the big companies, they can pay. But of course, taxation doesn't actually work like that. You can't really tax companies. You can only tax human beings, right? I mean, you can tax the companies that they work in, but the tax gets passed on. So the consequence of a successful FTSE 100 company facing a higher corporation tax bill isn't just the guy at the top who might be worth millions of pounds paying more tax. It will mean they have less room for manoeuvre to give their workers pay rises. It will mean that they might not be able to expand on recruitment if they were thinking of opening a new plant or a new sub-office or something. It will mean they pay out less in dividends. So if you're saving for a pension, your share portfolio associated with your pension will be worse. They may well try and pass on the prices to consumers. So when you're going about your daily shopping or buying their products or services, you'll find them more expensive. So we've got to remember that these taxes end up being a tax more or less on ordinary folk. And I think that this dial up to 25% has come at exactly the wrong time. I'm a great believer in the Laffer curve, the famous Art Laffer curve. Very simple concept. Suggests if you tax everything at 0%, you clearly get no revenues in for the government. If you tax everything at 100%, you get no revenue in for the government, because if income tax was 100%, nobody would work. So there's an extreme rate of tax where you also get naught. So there's a sort of curve, right? And if your aim, I'm not sure it should be the aim, but if your aim is to maximize government revenue, it's a kind of Goldilocks problem. You not too hot, not too cold, just right. Yeah. And I suspect that 25% corporation tax is beginning to get too hot, that you might actually get, if your only aim was government revenue to raise the maximum amount of tax, you might well find that it's the case that lower rates would help. More people would invest. Even if your corporation tax receipts go down, it might be that these companies would be employing more people if corporation tax was lower, and then those people pay income tax and VAT and the rest of it. So I think it's a counterproductive move. I think the political optics of it are kind of, we'll get everything back from these big companies rather than ordinary people. The economics of it, however, is you're clawing it back from ordinary people.
Yeah, and you touched upon unemployment in that answer. And David Oliver, one of our viewers, made a comment on the screen there about getting unemployment down. I mean, as I see it, we've got an unemployment time bomb ticking away, because not everyone who comes back from furlough is going to end up back in their job. And so we need an incentive for large companies, and well, actually all companies, but large companies particularly, to be able to employ more people. Do you see anything in the budget that actually has any concern over unemployment, has any interest in making sure we get people back into work, or is that being kicked into the long grass?
I don't think there's anything much here. I mean, there's a few my eyes glaze over when you hear the Chancellor at the dispatch box saying we've got a kickstart scheme and a restart scheme and a help to grow scheme. I mean, these have been tried and tested for decades, and an apprenticeship scheme and all of this sort of stuff, all very well intentioned, but a complete waste of resources. In running the IEA, I don't want help to grow from some government advisor. I just want them to get out of my way, tax me less, regulate me less. I'll be able to grow the organisation more rapidly. So I think there are very, very few crumbs of comfort, and it's an affliction of modern politics. I think on both sides of the aisle, the Conservative and the Labour side, indeed all parties beyond the Conservative Party and the Labour Party as well, that things like how many people are employed, or what's the GDP growth rate per annum, are sort of treated as exogenous acts of God, like whether it rains or not, or whether it's sunny or not, or whether there's a full moon or not. And the truth of the matter is, whilst the government can't pull levers to perfectly affect the economy, they can do things to make things better or worse. And I think Rishi Sunak hasn't done anything really to help on, as you rightly say, Bill, what will need to be a massive reallocation of labour. I don't know the numbers, and although I'm an economist, I'm not a forecaster, but let's say 2 or 3 million people lose their jobs, the furlough scheme comes to an end. We've got a colossal reallocation of labour needed. And the hope of our politicians just seems to be, well, if we make a few speeches about buccaneering Brexit Britain, then the private sector will step up to the plate. I'm sure the private sector wants to step up to the plate. I'm sure in large part it will step up to the plate. The British private sector is truly impressive in aggregate, but they're not being given much help or assistance in that stepping up to the plate. In fact, if anything, they're being marginally hindered. So I would have loved to have seen things. I mean, there is an extension of the business rates holiday, but I think he should have thought much more radically. Scrap employers' national insurance contributions for sake of argument. Complete overhaul of business rates. Absolutely ridiculous system of taxing bricks and mortar businesses. And I'm afraid all of that was absent, really. It's been an extension of some of the emergency schemes. I don't think I would have extended them in quite the way Rishi Sunak did, but that's not a hill I'm going to die on. When exactly does the furlough scheme end? This month, next month, the month after, or September? The universal credit uplift, do we end it now or pay out another 6 months? Those are not unimportant decisions for those affected, but in terms of the overall balance sheet, they're more or less rounding errors. But the important thing is, right, let's assume the economy reopens on June the 21st fully. And I hope it's rather earlier than that, given the apparent good news about COVID infections falling and deaths falling and the rest of it. What's going to get the economy motoring forward? And it will be the brilliance of British workers, British business people, entrepreneurs, and the rest of it. But they've got this burden on their back, and the burden on the back is the government, and the government should do more just to get out of the way, not running infrastructure projects and industrial strategies and kickstart and help to grow schemes. That's frankly a wasteful distraction.
Absolutely, and I'd see this constant effort by governments to do this, and they never really appreciate the private sector, as I see it. And you mentioned their Brexit buccaneering spirit. Well, one of the things that I always hoped and believed when we achieved Brexit would be that we could unlock that spirit. We could allow people to go out there and really, really get the private sector really booming. But this corporation tax increase and much of the underlying thinking within this budget appears to be completely alien to that concept. And you talk about there weren't radical ideas towards free markets. I'd suggest that really the radical ideas from this budget are actually towards that Soviet model that we spoke about, obviously without the gulags, as you say. But that's the radicalism appears to be coming through in this. And I find it very concerning. I also think that when you've got the two main parties in Parliament who really can't disagree on this, they're both going down that same route. I don't see a way forward, and I don't see anyone within that political sphere putting forward these ideas that we're discussing here. And I would suggest to you that possibly the way we're going now, we've totally discounted any Brexit dividends that we might get with these kind of policies. And the private sector is in for a very, very rough and rocky period of time if this train of thought continues.
Don't much disagree with you, Bill, but if anything, I think you're being a bit too generous to the two major parties. You said the sort of radicalism here in the budget. There isn't any radicalism in the budget. The budget is a completely straightforward piece of 1970s Keynesian social democratic Butsker-like consensus. There's nothing radical about it at all. It's very much like the British political consensus that we had for the 50s, 60s, and large parts of the 70s until Margaret Thatcher split that open and said that this political consensus of the man in Whitehall knows best needs to end. The man in Whitehall doesn't know best. We need to liberate the private sector, which often sounds very businessy, but liberating the private sector is about liberating the workers and householders and letting people buy their own council flat and all of that sort of stuff. Power to the people. It's in some ways it could be sloganized in quite a left of centre fashion. So, I don't think it's very radical thinking here. I think it is the tried, tested, and failed model of European social democracy. It's not as bad as the Soviet Union. It really isn't. But it is a very poor model. If what you want is economic growth, increasing wages, dynamism, looking out into the world and the rest of it. So I agree with you. I think we are in danger of squandering the opportunities of Brexit, that the powers that we have taken back control over, unfortunately, might not be used in a particularly pro-freedom direction, that we'll sort of say, oh, great, now we're no longer bound by the state aid rules. That means we can bail out failing British companies with British taxpayers' money. As if we haven't been down this road before. So we have, if you like, been given the freedom to reenact the idiotic policies that Britain pursued in the 1960s and large parts of the 1970s. And I hope we don't use the freedom in that way. To strike a slightly more optimistic note, the Brexit dividend doesn't need to be grabbed immediately, right? A government in 10, 15 or 20 years' time can take advantage of these new freedoms and opportunities for being out of the European Union. And similarly, we're now out of the EU regulatory orbit. So even if we're not doing much, barely anything, frankly, to get rid of the vast amount of EU red tape we've inherited. People seem to have forgotten all about that. I thought the point of leaving the EU was that there was a huge amount of regulation and law which we didn't think was appropriate to the United Kingdom. But I cannot think of anything much that we've changed. I think we've reduced the VAT on Tampax from 20% to 5%. May well be a good policy, but it's
burning issue of the day.
but it's not. There hasn't been a systematic way of going through the stock that we've inherited, the acquis that we've inherited from the EU. But we will at least avoid the flow. And it's my judgment that even if you think this budget is a bust, and I do, that more likely than not in the years to come, the European Union will regulate things even more fantastically stupidly than the British government, whatever those new things might be, artificial intelligence, bioscience, or the rest. I don't have a huge faith that the British government will get it right, but I think they might get it less wrong than Brussels. So there'll still be a Brexit dividend. But I agree with you, Bill. This is not the sort of liberation that you and I were dreaming of when we both voted for Brexit in June 2016, right? These are not the sunlit uplands we hoped to be in.
Very different to many a conversation I remember us having, actually. Very, very different. But you did put me in mind of badly paraphrasing a Mrs. Thatcher quote where she said the socialists raise their fist and they say power to the people, but actually they mean power to the state. And, in her case, the very opposite was true. But let's see. Maybe there is something free markety. Maybe there is something positive in this budget. Free ports. It's not a new idea, but it's fairly new for them to start to be put into place. What's your sort of overall take on that and the places that they've been put into?
Yeah, this is a good move. So the idea is that there'll be a certain area of land that is exempt from a good range of taxes and regulation. In large part, the theory is not so much that we in the British Isles will immediately see the benefits of that. It's not quite like, you and me going to the duty-free shop at Heathrow, but it will allow Britain to be a trading hub. Things can come in, but, the widgets can come in from one country, the screwdrivers can come in from another. You can screw them all together at Southampton docks and off they go to be sold to some other part of the world without all of the taxes applying to all of those different things. So I think it's a good idea. I think it's going to be fascinating to see whether they actually end up being, whether they might have opened Pandora's box in a kind of good way here, that you might start seeing, well, okay, how far inland can we move this exactly? And once you can move it more inland, will there be a big casino opening in Southampton, that might not be effective if you put that in the Freeport area? Or is it all just about widgets coming in from Indonesia and being tied to a wheel that's come in from Sierra Leone or something? So potentially you can move that, and I think it's 8 or 10 so far. I can't recall, but that's a good move. I applaud that. I mean, it's a step in the right direction. But having taken that step, I hope they take the next steps on the journey. You know what? It's very similar. I know it's based around ports in particular, but it's very similar to the strategy there used to be on enterprise zones. Here's a particularly distressed area of the United Kingdom. Let's give it enterprise zone status with, less regulatory burdens, lower taxes, and the rest of it. And I'm not against that per se, but I've always said I'm not really in favour of enterprise zones. I want there to be one enterprise zone called the United Kingdom. And if these sort of policies are good for a distressed area of the northeast, then they're probably also good for Surrey and Hampshire, right? So step in the right direction on free ports. 2 cheers for that. But I think it's only the first step on a journey, and I hope that the consequence of it will be rolling them out more, not just to more ports, but wider areas that come under the free port jurisdiction where they're already based.
Yeah, well, I think the one inland area they suggested for it was East Midlands Airport. I saw Roger Helmer cheering quite happily about that, which does, as you say, beg the question, well, why not Birmingham Airport? Why not Luton Airport? Why not X, Y, and Z airports? Why that one in particular? Yeah. But and it is good, but you've touched upon something there. These ideas, enterprise zones, free ports. Surely, if a government can recognise that these kind of things are good for business, good for the economy, and yet they're only going to put them into a handful of places, the thinking on that is somewhat skewed. Like you said, why can we not even just aim for the whole country to be an enterprise zone, to be to have this kind of free status? I'm guessing, from back in the economist point of view, that'd be a huge blow in the short term to the Treasury.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you, to some degree, that's right. If you want a very large public sector, and we now have a very, very large public sector, let's say it's 56% of GDP this year, but I mean, that is an anomaly because of what's happened over the pandemic. But, it's typically into the 40s, so it's, it's not much of an exaggeration to say it's been towards, getting on towards half of all national income. So if you want all of that, and if you want all of that provided by the state, and you want more of it, you want the NHS budget to go up and the schools budget to go up and state pensions to be triple locked and more support for, maternity cover and paternity cover and all of the rest of it. If you want all of those things and a functioning military and courts and grants for the arts, I mean, those tend to be much smaller items, then you've got to pay for it somehow. And you need to extract that money from the private sector. Now, I think we've gone too far in that direction. I'm not an anarchist. Indeed, I'm probably more of a classical liberal even than a libertarian. I think there is a role for the state, even in redistribution. But I think it's gone way, way, way too far. But unless as a politician, you're willing to sort of sketch out, I think I'm right in saying in roundabout terms, public expenditures around about £800 billion, there or thereabouts. Well, unless you're willing to sketch out how you're going to get that down to 600 billion, let's be a bit more radical, 400 billion, unless you're going to start to talk about ways in which you are cutting government expenditure by 20%, 30%, 50%. And I'm willing to talk about that, but I have the luxury of not being an elected politician, not relying on people's votes. If you're not willing to talk about that, you've got to use Dennis Healey's old phrase. He was the last Chancellor of the Exchequer to put up corporation tax, by the way, in 1974. And that didn't lead to great success for Dennis Healey. He's talked about we're going to squeeze the rich until the pips squeak. And if you want to keep spending this amount of money in the public sector, you are going to have to keep squeezing not just the rich, everybody until the pips squeak. And you might think that that's worth doing for building a new hospital or having more computers in our schools, but be aware of the cost of it. But therefore, on the flip side, for people of a more sort of free market persuasion, Bill, like you and I, there is a duty on us to sketch out what's going to have to go. If you want all of the airports to be free ports and all of the ports to be free ports, as I probably do, then the tough part of the equation for us is spell out your 200 or 300 billion pounds in savings then. And that's the more uncomfortable part of the equation for us. And we've got to be honest and open about that and spell out what those sort of savings would be.
Well, I guess the first step really in lessening the spending would be to stop the new spending. Now, there's a couple of areas of new spending in there. I think you briefly addressed the fact that you're quite happy with furlough going on for a little bit longer, but there are more grants and these seemingly impossible to redeem loans that are going out to businesses mentioned in this budget, and also investment in left behind areas. I've seen an example of, several examples of Conservative MPs jumping for joy that they've got 20 or 25 million quid going to their area that's going to go into a new outdoor market that no one's going to visit anyway, and various things like that. I'm guessing that your standpoint on virtually all of that would be, hang on, we're going in the wrong direction, or we need to roll back, or is there any of that you can see some benefit to?
Well, there is some benefit. That I think, Bill, isn't the question, right? If you build a massive new open-air market in Bishop Auckland that nobody ever visits and nothing's ever sold at, there is still some benefit. There'll be some building work happening in Bishop. The question isn't whether there is any benefit. There is some. The question is it worth the candle? Do you get enough juice for the squeeze? And I don't think you do. Governments make very bad investment decisions. You are far better to return power to these areas themselves, to lower the tax burden and the regulatory burden on them, to allow entrepreneurs in those areas to work out whether they want to open a new theatre or a sports centre or whatever. Far better. So I mean, I'm all in favour of these areas growing. It's just a question of the mechanism. And I think if you just set the private sector free, rather than having some sort of committee in Whitehall working out exactly who's going to get this particular roundabout built in their town, or this particular bypass, or this particular shopping centre, completely ludicrous way of rejuvenating those parts of the country. And in fact, if you broadly look across the United Kingdom, it's not completely true, but it's a fairly good correlation. The areas that have typically done well over the past 10, 20 or 30 years have been areas in which state spending is relatively low as a proportion of income. In fact, in London, it is, for all its wokery and sort of left-leaning knit your own quiche type dinner parties, London actually has a pretty small state sector as a portion of its income. I think it's around about 30%. You're in Singapore territory there. And no surprise, London is extremely affluent. It's done very, very well over the past 20 or 30 years. If you were to take some of the deprived areas, Hartlepool, for sake of argument, you're looking at, I'm going back a few years, but these numbers won't have changed that much. You're looking at a state sector that's 65, 70, 75% of the economy. Merseyside has had a bit of a renaissance recently, but over its disastrous period, it was because the state was too big. And this government's response to that seems to be to get the state to do even more. So I think it's just approaching the problem from the wrong end of the telescope. But again, these are actually quite small beer schemes, right? And as were these sort of kickstart, restart, apprenticeship schemes, help to grow schemes. I mean, you can love them or loathe them, but they're nickel and dime stuff. The big items are welfare spending. That's the biggest. The National Health Service and education. And together, those three amount to not far off 2/3 of the overall national budget. Now, you could squeeze an awful lot more out of the other third. You could abolish international aid altogether. You could abolish the Arts Council. You could cut grants to local government. You could trim a bit more off the military. You could do those things in that third, but you don't save a huge amount of money there. The big money is in health, education and welfare. And you've got to really decide what sort of approach you're going to take to those three if you're serious about public spending going down. It's not the only way you can do it. As I say, you could squeeze in the other third. That's roughly what the coalition government did. It tried to find all its savings in that third of the pie. But I think we've got to take a long, hard look, particularly at welfare, which, in my view, is not really a very successful poverty relief mechanism in Britain anymore.
Well, you're now touching on political kryptonite. You're now touching on the reality of why we don't balance our books in this country, why austerity, as the Tories put it, was just a con, because it wasn't austerity, because it didn't really have the desired effect. And one of the things that we've got to take into account on the national spending of this country is debt interest. Even though we've got low rates of interest, this amount of debt is still a significant interest repayment. So, all right, then with your radical economist's head on, you've identified these areas these are the problem areas. These are the areas where spending is huge. Let's assume that we've taken as a government a decision that we're going to get the debt down and we're looking to reform these areas. Well, where do we start?
Okay, I think we've got to have a serious discussion about the National Health Service, because I don't think it's a particularly good mechanism of providing healthcare. And I must say, I think the sort of all of this, standing on your doorstep and applauding for 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, there's something positively North Korean about this. I don't know whether Stalin, I think it used to be the first person to stop applauding was taken out and shot, and it felt a bit like that. Whether you're clapping for carers, a bizarre, absolutely bizarre national obsession here. I'm not criticising the doctors, the nurses. They've been through a lot. All credit to them, the people who work in this profession. No problem with that at all. But I don't stand on my doorstep. I'm very grateful that in my flat I've got clean running water. But I don't stand on my doorstep at 8 o'clock at night and give a round of applause to the sewage workers. It's absolutely bananas. Health is a service. I'm grateful for the people who provide it, but I'm also grateful to my plumber, my roofer, and my cab driver. These are services, important services, healthcare. And I think we've got to have a really long, hard look about whether we are providing healthcare in the right way. As soon as you mention that, people get very frightened that healthcare will only be for the rich, that it will be like, oh, blimey, well, if I need cancer treatment, what am I going to do? But actually, this is an area in which I think that we've got quite a bit to learn from some other European countries. Unless you think Johnny Foreigner always gets it wrong, I think we could look at the Swiss healthcare system, the German healthcare system, the Dutch healthcare system, which run much more efficiently than ours and have universal coverage. Everybody is covered. If you can't afford your coverage, it is provided for you. But that doesn't mean that the whole thing is run by the state. That Matt Hancock is effectively the chief executive of one of the largest employers in the world. I think the National Health Service, the Indian Nationalised Railways, and the Chinese Red Army compete for the top 3 places. I don't know which of those kill the most people, but it's ridiculous to run healthcare in that fashion. So we've got to have a proper debate about that without people thinking that if you criticise the NHS, you're criticising doctors and nurses and medical professionals. You're not. We've got to have a serious debate about the system. And I would like to move to a much more social insurance system where I think we will get many bangs for our buck. But I don't think that would save much money. I think it would just give you better health outcomes. Education, similarly. I think we've got to reform to get more free schools and far less Whitehall top-down national curriculum setting. It's Tuesday, it's 3 o'clock, you're 13 years old, therefore we're doing Key Stage 4 on Shakespeare's Macbeth. I mean, it's unbelievably prescriptive, and education's become a kind of form-filling exercise with much more freedom in education. But I don't think that would get the bill down. It would just be better education. So I think a lot's got to be done on welfare. Welfare spending in Britain, transfer payments is what I'm measuring here. And just to be clear of the definition there, a transfer payment is an economic term meaning when you take money from one cohort and give it to the other. So typically from the rich to the poor, but we also give from earners to the elderly in the sake of pensions. We give money from the childless to people with children in the forms of child benefits. So any money that transfers hand. Now, the total bill for that in the UK this year will be somewhere in the region. We're going to spend about £13,000 per household per year. That's about the spending. Now, most households, I think, can stand on their own 2 feet, right? The overwhelming majority. So let's say, I'm oversimplifying here, but let's say it's only the bottom 10% of households we're worried about. The top 90%, they can look after themselves. They might not all be flush and rich, but they can look after themselves. We really want to focus this on the bottom 10% of households. Well, you would have £130,000 per year per household to focus on that bottom 10%. As Ronnie Reagan once said, somewhere there must be some overhead, because if you are spending this amount on poverty relief and poverty has not been obliterated for the cost of 13 grand a household per year, something's going colossally wrong. So I would like to see a much more targeted welfare system, and for it to be the norm that you're not receiving welfare. The norm. That welfare should be targeted not on the squeezed middle, but on the very bottom. We can have an argument about whether that's the bottom 5%, 10%, 15%, or whatever. And of course, people move in and out of those cohorts. You might need support when you've lost a job or whatever, but it should be focused on those levels. I can see Harry Johnson's put the question, what about sustainably reducing the foreign aid and Quango spending? Yeah, but even if you scrapped all of that, you have not got as far as you need to solve the problem. Foreign aid spending is 0.5% of GDP. It's not trivial, but it's trivial compared to the scale of the problem we've got to solve.
Well, if we're talking about these, to focus it more on actually genuinely working tax credits, should they be revised or got rid of?
Sorry, I lost you just for a second there, Bill. I think you were asking about working tax credits and what we should do on working tax credits.
Yes, I was. Yeah.
This is where I think welfareism goes nuts, because this is, if you like, dragging more and more what are ordinary folk into the welfare system. And, I think you would be far, far better to tackle these problems typically through just reducing income tax, right? I mean, so if you're going out and earning, rather than that you're paying income tax over here and then getting working tax credits over there, fiscal churn, as economists call it, I think we've got to start moving people away from that system. Of course, a lot of the money is targeted at the elderly through pensions, which in my view are outrageously triple locked. What that means is the state pension goes up every year by 2.5%, or earnings growth, or inflation, whichever is the highest of those. So in theory, I won't say this will actually happen, but in theory, if young people start working so hard and brilliantly that their earnings go up 20%. Some of the beneficiaries of that are people who've already retired. That seems odd to me. I mean, I can see why you might want to keep...
I'm sure it's nothing to do with the fact that people of pensionable age are the ones who are most likely to vote.
Well, that's right. And here is the problem. And I really hope democracy can somehow find a way of solving this. I think it might also be another Ronnie Reagan wrote quote, if you rob Peter to pay Paul, you can be sure of Paul's vote. And that's sort of the problem, right? So, so the gaming of it is, let's sort of look at the rich, the millionaires, the Amazons. There's not many of them, you know, there's not many billionaires in the country. And let's rob them, let's take the money from them and then give it to all of these vast swathes of Jack and Jills in order to get their vote. Let's rob Peter to pay both Paul and Pauline, and that should give us 2 votes out of 3. The problem with that is it leads to economic destruction in the long term. We need to take a step back, look at the economy as a whole. I think we've got to think a lot more, in not just economic terms, moral terms, about the next generation. If you are worried at all about what climate change and the environment might be doing for our children and grandchildren, I'm not saying you should be worried about it, but if you're worried about it at all, you should be apoplectic about the state of the public finances that we're leaving them. If you believe that we have a duty of stewardship to the generations coming after us, I'm not saying that the environment shouldn't be a consideration, but so, oh my God, should the public finances. And we are passing on debts for money that we are spending on ourselves to our children, our grandchildren, the unborn and the unconceived. And quite apart from that being bad economics, I think that's morally reprehensible as well.
Well, I think much of what we've discussed has been about what needs to be addressed, where the real financial issues are, but the fact that short-termism in politics means that they're very hard to address. You know, the areas that you've touched upon. If anyone went into beginning a program of reform in welfare benefits, or the NHS, or pensions, the golden opportunity for the other party, whichever one it may be of the top 2, to take the opposite stance and win the next election, terrifies the hell out of them. So we're kind of stuck in this endless cycle towards the destruction and the sort of awful situation that you've just laid out because of the short-term nature of politics. And we don't have someone, a Margaret Thatcher, who could win a huge majority and then take the tough decision and have the guts to try and hold that line. We don't have those figures anymore. Would that be a reasonable assessment, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right, but it's not obvious where the political leadership for these sort of ideas might emerge from. And, it's, I don't know who the next prime minister will be, let alone the next prime minister but one, or the prime minister after that. I don't know. I think you're right that to get out of this requires political leadership. And politicians are more, if you like, the victims and the prisoners of the climate of opinion than the shapers of it. So they look at, you started at the top of the show, Bill, by looking through the polls. That's what guides most government policy, right? If the polls say this, the people want this, we've got to, in democracy, you do actually have to compromise with the electorate, right? I mean, so if the electorate want X, typically you'll try and deliver them X. But that said, although I'm not saying that I have in mind a particular person who might be able to do this, I don't know whether the knight on the white horse is. I don't know when or where the cavalry will arrive from. I think if you did have the political leadership to do this, it could work. And Thatcher and Reagan showed it worked, that you can run on a radical, rather difficult, tough program of reform. And if it works, you don't just do well for the economy, you're re-elected. Twice in landslides in Margaret Thatcher's case, once in a total landslide in Ronald Reagan's case, and he definitely would have won a 3rd term, probably a 4th and a 5th term after that. So I think if politicians want to actually have a long career and a meaningful one, where they really transform the country that they are leading or involved in the leadership of, then actually they should think in their own narrow interests, not just in the interests of the citizens, much longer term. You've got to think, okay, what does the country need over a 5 or 10 year plan? And you know what? The British electorate aren't idiots. I don't think that you need to patronize them. I think you can put it on the line and say, look, here is the problem. you've got all these snake oil salesmen saying that everybody can have everything and it will all be paid for by an increase in corporation tax. That ain't so. We're going to have some hard decisions. This is the basis on which I'm going to make my hard decisions. But it's not all a bitter pill. There's quite a lot of sugar to help the medicine go down. We are going to radically lower tax. We are going to get the economy moving. We are going to get growth going. We are going to try and make sure that government policy gets out of the way so that the economy starts growing again at 3% a year, not this miserable 1.5% a year. And the difference between 3% and 1.5% doesn't sound much, but when you compound that over a 5 or 10 year time horizon, it's colossal in terms of your wages going up over that sort of time horizon. Somebody's got to find the political leadership to, the bravery to do that, to think not what today's YouGov polls say, but what do I think the YouGov poll will be saying in 5 years' time. And Thatcher and Reagan, I think, were very successful because they knew what they believed in. They had a great conviction of doing what they saw to be the right thing. They were confident that their policy would work. I have to say, I think in Rishi Sunak's case, he doesn't sound confident it will work. I recommend you listen to his Today programme interview this morning when he was asked about, does he now believe that if you raise tax rates, you'll get more revenue? I mean, he was all over the place. It wasn't at all clear what Rishi Sunak believes. So you need somebody who's got fairly clear beliefs, or at least instincts. They don't need to be a scholar or an economist. The right instincts, the right courage, and the ability to sell that to the British people. That person's missing from the equation at the moment. But if they can be found, then I think there'll be a lot to be optimistic about.
I agree with you. And one thing we missed out from the budget, which I do want a quick couple of minutes from you on, if possible, this 5% deposit idea on mortgages. It feels like familiar territory. It feels like we've had problems with this before, but it's being pushed again. Quick couple of minutes thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that the government would realise what the real problem is with the housing market. And it's not on the demand side, it's on the supply side. So you get all of these schemes. Effectively, what this scheme will mean is that there are now more people able to get a mortgage. So you've got more people and more money chasing the same housing stock, basically. And if the stock is fixed, but the number of people and the amount of money chasing that stock goes up, the prices will go up. So it's very similar to the Help to Buy scheme. Again, well-intentioned, but what it tends to do is to jack up property prices. What we need actually in Britain is a massive building programme. It doesn't need to be done by the government, just hasten to add. The last thing I want is government-built houses, but we need to liberalise and free up large amounts of land. They don't need to be sites of natural beauty. But large parts of land to build houses on them. If the supply goes up, so the stock increases, then the price will fall. And I think this is now an increasing intergenerational saw. I was lucky. I got on the property ladder in 1995 when I bought a 2-bedroom flat in Fulham for £110,000. And having got on at that level, I've just made money out of this ever since. But folk who are in their 20s now, as I was in 1995, people who work for them, they're nowhere near getting on the property ladder. And that's because we froze the stock. So the right way to solve this is not, do you need a 95% mortgage, a 98% mortgage, a 92% mortgage? Here's a Help to Buy scheme as long as you're a first-time buyer and blah, 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 blah. No, build, see the stock grow. And then actually these schemes would rightly be seen to be rounding errors, or sometimes worse than rounding errors. They're making the problem worse because they're just going to jack up property prices even further.
Well, thank you for that. Now, it's been a brilliant nearly hour. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been the dissection of these ideas have been great, but we've waited all this time. We're into the last couple of minutes now. I've got to ask you the really important issue of the day. How's it going with Southampton Football Club?
Well, rather mixed blessings. This is the first, initially brilliant, now catastrophically, right? So we might be the first team in Premier League history to be top of the table and relegated in the same season. We have if we're not relegated, and the odds are against that, we've got a little bit of a buffer of points before to be relegated. I think I can say with certainty we will be the first team in top flight history to have lost 9-0 in 2 consecutive seasons to 2 different clubs and still stay up. Obviously, your lot, Bill, Wolverhampton Wanderers, beat us rather fortunately at St Mary's. But here's the glimmer of hope. Southampton are still in the FA Cup.
Yeah,
So
sort of
and
pulling that one.
we beat Wolves, of course, to get through to the quarterfinal. I don't think we'll win it, but you know what football's like. It's always a victory of hope over reality. You know, I kind of, in my mind's eye, Southampton can still win the FA Cup and definitely won't be relegated. But, you know, football's more about the pain than the glory, and is always really hope over reality. So that's what I feel about Southampton Football Club. I just would like to feel I don't feel that about free market economics quite the same way. I hope there's some reality bringing that to bear, not just a forlorn hope, however bleak things look at the moment. So pretty bleak on the budget, pretty bleak at the moment for the Saints. But I think Saints will just about get through and go on to better things. That might be a forlorn hope. Brexit Britain will get through this. And I think not next week, not next year, but in 5 or 10 years' time, actually, we can look to much, much better days.
Well, that's a great note to finish on, and let's hope that Saints survive. I'm sure they will if Danny Ings gets fit again, and certainly Brexit Britain will perhaps emulate Manchester City rather than Wolves or Saints. Mark Littlewood, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure, mate. Thanks for being on, and to everyone who's watched this, if you enjoyed it, share it round. Please subscribe on Open Dialogue, just on the YouTube channel, and tell your friends. And let them see the wisdom of Mark and the things that he said today. You don't always get this kind of content on every channel. So from me, I'd like to say thank you, Mark. And if your final word on that.
Well, Bill, it's always a pleasure to speak to you, and I hope we can put our Saints and Wolves differences aside, and it won't be too long before, rather than only meeting you virtually, I can meet you properly for a drink in a pub before too many weeks are out. So, that will happen. So things really are on the up. We're into the end game now. Freedom's coming back.
Beautiful note to finish on. I look forward to that day in the pub, mate. From everyone here on Head to Head, I wish you a good night and thanks very much for watching.